Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Monday Morning Art History, which might be Monday afternoon or Monday evening, depending on where you are. And we're going to try and talk about, or at least introduce you to some art and architecture from Europe and North America in the first part of the 19th century. And I think I'll start out with a cartoon because the humor still works, but this is by a French cartoonist around the beginning of the 19th century. And it shows you that there was an argument going on. And the argument here, it symbolizes Romanticism versus Neoclassicism. And interestingly, we're going to find out in today's lecture, they actually weren't always dueling. They actually had a lot of overlap. There were many artists that had flavors of both of these approaches in their artwork. But for the purposes of the cartoon, we can see that over on the left side is Delacroix, and Delacroix has a large paintbrush that he can load with color and paint with impasto. There's a reason that they used to make fun of him as the pastry cook painter for that broad brush. On the other side is, and I'm going to try and use my nasal voice, Ingres, the great academic painter, the great hero of drawing and drafting, who has a sharpened pen. And in front of the Academy, they do battle representing two different points of view. So the opening of the 19th century, you want to remember that it was the empire period of Napoleon, the period of conquest, the period of empire. And Jacques-Louis David, who we learned about in an earlier lecture, honestly was the ultimate political chameleon. After, making paintings that argued for revolution, he later supported an emperor. And the story goes that he didn't meet Napoleon first. He actually saw a bust of Napoleon's head and held it in his hands and admired how handsome Napoleon was. And then it was all over. So he was working for Napoleon in the early 19th century. And this is a painting that there are two versions of this. One of them's at Versailles. It's in the interior of Notre Dame, which, if you're following the news, was just reopened after a miraculous 5-year restoration. I had to put that in there. But it shows the coronation of Napoleon, which honestly was an event that it was controversial to even represent that event because Napoleon crowned himself. And what David made some adjustments. He showed Napoleon crowning Josephine instead of, self-appointing himself. And he also put Napoleon's mother there. She is in the archway at the very, very bottom, the central figure. And she did not attend this event because she didn't think it was a good idea for her son to crown himself. But there it is in a crisply drawn neoclassical style, a great history painting with a couple small falsehoods. And it shows how painting was adapting to the empire period. A great tourist attraction today, still standing, is the Church of La Madeleine, which is currently a Catholic church. It was commissioned by Napoleon as a temple, of course, to himself and to his empire, but later was, completed and rededicated. And you can see that it's really a dead-on copy of a Roman temple surrounded by a Corinthian colonnade. And it lets you know that the official style of the empire was, of course, classicism, because Napoleon saw himself as, you name it, the next Alexander the Great, the next Roman emperor, bringing back this greatness that honestly wasn't necessarily something you could connect with France, but you're allowed a fantasy when you have an empire. And when Napoleon's sister married his first consul, she was the vivacious 23-year-old widow already when she married this man. She asked that the neoclassical sculptor Canova would portray her as Venus. And can you imagine? Well, actually, I'm starting to be able to imagine it. I was going to say, can you imagine a political figure or a political wife now having herself portrayed in the nude as Venus? Maybe we're going to be seeing that soon. And it recalls so many precedents, including Etruscan sarcophagi and also, the painting of Titian, who made his famous and delicate nude Venus with her chambermaids behind her. And it lets you know that the neoclassical style, was prevalent even for portraits. The Romantic style served a kind of different ideology and a different set of purposes. And this is a long list, but I'll try to excerpt from it and just give you a flavor for Romanticism. The Romantic artists, in rejecting neoclassicism, they thought, let's do away with harmony and balance and idealization, all of which neoclassical artists would have valued. They took their ideas mainly from Germany, from the great German period of literature that we call Sturm und Drang, the Storm and Stress. And they wanted to portray the heroic individual. And the heroic individual could also be connected with the subjective, the irrational, even the occult. And, to add to the list, more good adjectives, the personal, the spontaneous, and the emotional made their way into Romanticism. It definitely valued emotion over reason. And of course, you can see it's a reaction to the whole movement we called the Age of Reason in a previous presentation. Nature plays a really important role in Romantic art because nature becomes a kind of a secular gateway, if you will. It's a gateway to the transcendent and to the spiritual. And finally, Romanticism really values the individual creator. And we talked about that when we focused on Blake and Turner last time. So still a few more empire paintings by a pupil of David, by Gros, a great academic painter. We have an adventure of Napoleon in Haifa in the Middle East. And what's happening here is that Napoleon is given a Christ-like or a saintly power to heal, because in a house filled with men suffering from the plague, Napoleon reaches out and touches a man, and of course is going to heal him. And around him, you can see that Napoleon's soldiers, who don't know that yet the bubonic plague was transmitted by rats and mice, holds a handkerchief over his mouth and is in awe of the bravery of Napoleon reaching out and healing this man in the house of pestilence. And it's presented in a grand historic manner, framed by arches with exotic architecture in the background. And I have to tell you, exoticism is a great romantic theme. Here's a way that literature provided subject matter for romantic art. This is another student of David, and this painting has a very, very interesting kind of literary background. It comes from a book by a novelist named Chateaubriand, and it told the story of a young Christian girl who was Native American, right? So Christianized Native American. She fell in love with an Indian named Chakas. And if you're catching a Romeo and Juliet vibe here, you're on the right track. However, because she was a Christian and this love threatened her obligation to chastity, she chose to poison herself as to resolve this, to keep the duties to her faith. So it is an absolute tragedy, but you'll notice that one of the themes that's appearing in this moment is a kind of a theme of bringing back Christianity. And you'll remember that Catholicism had been the enemy of the French Revolution in the late 18th century. Now it's making kind of a comeback. In this tremendous allegorical painting by Ang, I can tell you that we really see both romantic and neoclassical themes. And if you're wondering what could be romantic about the idea of all these people in togas in front of a classical temple with a winged classical god, you're asking me, John, what's neoclassical? Well, I'll say two things. One is the tight and careful rendering. Remember that Ang had the pen, not the paintbrush. That is neoclassical, but what's romantic is the idea of Homer himself, the blind storyteller who, told the great epic stories of the classical past. He's a hero, oddly enough, maybe like Turner or like Blake, a visionary who had a very, very independent store in his own imagination. And that's a romantic value. This painting by Ang that you may have seen in the Louvre, it's a fantastically wonderful and weird painting. And you notice that she is a kind of a descendant, if you will, of Titian's Venus, but she's turned the other way. And as she turns the other way, if you take a moment, particularly if you have some background in medicine, or maybe you're a chiropractor, you're going to notice she has 3 or 4 extra vertebrae. like a mannerist figure, she has been kind of extended to accentuate this pose. And she looks back at us as she, runs the peacock feather across her thighs. I know I'm turned on. I don't know if you are, but there's the hookah there with the opium. So you're invited into her blue silk curtain chamber to smoke some opium with her. And she makes a look out your way, but she doesn't entirely make eye contact. We're going to leave that to Manet's Olympia later to be entirely inviting. But it's a great erotic scene. It's an eroticized scene of the Far East that French in the early 19th century could have as a permissible fantasy. Talking about the occult, I'm going to go back to the 18th century for a moment, but the Swiss artist Fuseli is really, you want to call him a proto-surrealist, somebody who went to dream imagery. And in this both occult and erotic image of the nightmare, we see a crystallized horse piercing from behind a curtain, and a gnomic, kind of a terrifying figure oppresses this white-robed virgin in her sleep, and her arms fall helplessly to the ground because she can't wake up from this nightmare. That is another great kind of romantic image. You might say that romanticism opened the gateway later to surrealism. We talked about Blake and we talked about Turner, but I again want to emphasize, what made them such great romantics. It was their individuality, and what an individual project it was on the part of Blake to envision his own deities and give them a different outlook and different capabilities than a traditional Christian depiction of God the Father would have done. So one of the greatest Romantic era artists has to be Goya. And I would love to give an all Goya lecture, and maybe someday we'll have the chance to do that. But I think what I want to do is focus on a few works to give you a feeling for his output. I should tell you, he started out as a neoclassical artist and a man who designed tapestries. He did some very, we'll call it, acceptable traditional work. But after 1792, when he suffered a terrifying illness, he had a 5-year period of recovery, and he had a disease that affected his brain. Was it a form of meningitis or what was it? You'll find some debates about that online. But when he kind of came back, his hearing had been affected. He was nearly deaf, and he looked around kind of the world that he had woken up to again, Rip Van Winkle style, and he saw Spain as a well of great irrationality. He saw Spain as a place that had abandoned the age of reason. And the prints that he published in 1799, right around the turn of the century, are caprices, or we'll call them caprichos. They are dark fantasies that air out and also ridicule his fears and the irrationality of the people of the time. And they have inscriptions. For example, plate number 2 shows a what would you call it? A matchmaker. The matchmaker is the kind of ape-like figure in the sharp lace collar that pushes a woman forward who is blindfolded. And of course, he had to be blindfolded to consider the suitors that she was leading you towards, probably wealthy older men. And the inscription reads, "They say yes and give their hand to the first comer." And then it goes on later to editorialize on the other page the readiness with which many women are inclined to be married, hoping therefore to live in greater liberty, dot, dot, dot. And of course, they're led into oppression. They are, what you call it, if you will, the harem women of Spain. Witchcraft was another topic of the Caprichos. In this one called Blow, you can see what's happening, that a haggard, topless witch is using a child who's farting as bellows, the best description I can give. And there is a sarcastic kind of inscription on the next page. "No doubt there was a great catch of children the previous night. The banquet they are preparing will be a rich one." And there were, of course, public figures that used imagery of witchcraft like this to spread fear. Like Blake, Goya greatly disliked organized religion, was very, very suspicious of the priesthood, and he showed the priests as being kind of demonic nocturnal figures. And when they wake up, They all go their ways, along with the witches, the hobgoblins, the apparitions, and the phantoms. So imagine what kind of a portrait would you get when you have a man with this mindset portraying the royal family? And the answer is it's a portrait that it really treaded a very, very careful line. It was a portrait that the royal family found acceptable. And yet, to us looking today, you can see that there is some gentle ridicule. If the king looks clueless to you, I'm going to agree with that characterization and look over the king's shoulder because there is a man peering over his shoulder. That is actually a minister who is having an affair with the queen. And the queen stands separately with her, holding the young prince and the princess by her hand and looking at us from the background. If you look at the far left in front of or excuse me, behind the canvas, there's Goya himself. He is replaying what he saw in Velázquez Maids of Honor, the idea of the artist as the person who controls the power of history by observing and creating the canvas. But what a subtle, slightly funny, and at the same time grand picture of the overstuffed Spanish royalty of the early 19th century. And there they are to admire with their medals, their sashes, and their expensive clothing, with the minister looking out over the king's shoulder. Goya also lived and painted tragedy. Apparently, he didn't directly witness this execution, but he did see some of the atrocities that happened when Napoleon's troops came into Madrid. And a very, very short version of what happened was that in 1808, many Spaniards, especially in the nobility, thought it would be a good thing if Napoleon came into Spain. They thought, well, we have such weak royalty, we could use a strong man. Napoleon is a great conqueror. Let's see what he can do. And of course, it was not a good idea for Napoleon to come into Spain, and there were tremendous atrocities. And in this one, the 3rd of May, you can see something remarkable that Goya did. He really gave us what Kubler-Ross would call the different stages of maybe of grief. We see a man in a Christ-like pose, raising his arms, about to be executed in the light of a lantern. And he seems to ask a question, why me? In front of him, we have the dead bodies of the men who have just been executed. And we have figures around him contemplating their fate. And we have a lineup. We have a lineup of those facing their own execution. And Goya turns away the French soldiers from us to make them faceless and to make them machines and to, kind of portray the killing machines that they had become for this kind of event. All of it under a pitch black sky. There has been a lot of discussion of Goya's late paintings, and they were found in a home he lived in Bordeaux after he, left Spain and retired in France toward the end of his career. Um, some of the frescoes have been de-authenticated, some have been authenticated, but we do think it's an authentic Goya, this mural of Saturn devouring one of his own children. Uh, what an extraordinary leap of imagination and of terror, like maybe the way Stephen King would paint if he could. And of course, it's an allegory because it says in the most awful way that adults, the seniors of the world, the cruel ones, devour the future by oppressing and taking away the future of their children. That's, what it's an allegory of through war or any other way. Géricault's Raft of the Medusa is a grand salon painting that was made through research. Again, you can make a whole presentation just about this painting, but let me tell you a little bit of what happened. Géricault was a romantic painter who wanted to make a very, very powerful, complete painting that made a social statement. And keep in mind, this is after the fall of Napoleon now. It's after 1815. And it has a kind of a post-empire point of view. So Géricault searched the newspapers, and initially he had an idea to make a painting about a landlord who had been murdered by his tenants. So that was his first idea. Then he heard about the sinking and the abandonment of the Raft of the Medusa, and he said, no, that's better. And he began to do research on this topic. And what had happened was that during the Bourbon Restoration, during the putting back of members of the royal family after Napoleon. An incompetent king had given an incompetent friend, the captainhood of some ships. And off the coast of North Africa, they went more than 100 miles off course, got stuck on a sandbar, and then they did the absolute worst thing. The king's appointees and the upwardly mobile people on the ship got off and took the lifeboat, and they left the crew afloat. And over a period of maybe 2 weeks, there was despair, death, starvation, cannibalism. I don't know how I could list all the things that happened. And when they were finally rescued, you can see there were just a few, coping, healthy people left, and a raft of despair and destruction. And Géricault actually had some of his friends, including Delacroix, model for the figures on this painting. And originally, the figure at the top of the pyramid was going to be waving the French flag, but Géricault decided that that was a little bit iffy, and he turned it into a shirt later. But if you think of this, could this be a Napoleonic allegory, an image of ruined and desperate France after Napoleon? I think you can probably see it that way. And one more thing I want to point out, it shows the problems or the situation of mankind in nature. Because whatever is happening at the human level or the political level, there's a great wave that's about to swamp everybody that is on board. But there's so much research in this painting, you can say maybe you'd have a documentary filmmaker deal with this kind of subject matter now. But Géricault interviewed the survivors of the raft. He read a book about the incident. He read all of the newspaper accounts. He really threw himself into this great painting, 23 and a half feet wide. Géricault had a romantic interest. He had an interest in the insane. And among the studies that he painted studies of people in asylums. This is a woman who I'm going to guess would have been in the late stages of syphilis, because there were hospitals all over Paris of women and men that were suffering degenerative syphilis and had to be put away. Sometimes then when they were brought out in public to do their shopping at the market, they wore these bonnets that identified them. But look at the intensity that she looks out at you with. And romantic artists had a kind of an admiration of the insane, like the surrealists, because they saw a purity and, if you will, a sense of difference in people who were insane that they could, in a way, relate to. There's another allegorical painting that I think has something to say in a hidden code about Napoleon. On the surface, it's a history painting about Sardanapalus. And Sardanapalus was an Assyrian ruler of ancient times that, when he found out from his advisors that the opposing army was about to take his palace, in other words, he was going to be killed and everyone would be captured, he said, nope, I'll have everybody killed in front of me ahead of time so they don't get the pleasure of doing this. So you can see his harem, his horses, his treasure, everything has been hauled into the throne room, and he gets to witness all of the killing, and then he'll probably light the match himself to burn it all down. So it's a story of a ruler who says, I really don't care about anyone else except myself, and I'll just let it all burn rather than letting someone else have it. And again, what a gruesome and grand romantic theme. A little bit of history. So what happened to France after Napoleon? Well, his final defeat was Waterloo in 1815, and a Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, was returned. However, the Napoleonic code, his legal code, was adapted. That was a kind of, a success, and there was a parliament. After the Restoration, the Catholic Church again became the state religion, and this all lasted until 1830, when the events, of revolution in the streets brought down the Bourbons once again. And that's the moment that we see in 1830. We see an allegorical figure of liberty. And of course, that makes you think of the French Statue of Liberty, the greatest gift they ever gave to the United States. But that kind of allegorical figure has been brought back, bare-breasted, and she holds the French tricolor, the flag of the revolution, which is happening again. And with some of the citizen soldiers, including a banker and a boy with a pistol. They trudge over the bodies of those who have lost their lives in the smoke and in the chaos, and she represents renewal. And if you watched the Olympic Games this time around, I only watched a little bit of it, but they had a woman at the top of a building in Paris singing the Marseillaise, and she was costumed, although her chest was covered, but she was costumed to be this kind of image of liberty all over again as a symbol. Here's some exoticism in the work of Delacroix. Delacroix was known for the trips he made into Morocco, where he, had a fascination with Arab life, and the sketches and the paintings that he made there were full of imaginative vigor and gave people another view of the world they called exotic, which was actually the world they were colonizing. And finally, some of this energy went into the decorations that you still see around Paris today. This, sculpture by Roudet took about 3 years to complete, and it's there on the Arc de Triomphe when you make your way through Paris as a tourist. And you can see it's an allegory of triumph with Joan of Arc in her armor up at the very, very top pointing forward. Uh, isn't it interesting to see that this sculpture, or this relief from the middle of the 19th century, already has to me a little bit of a hint of Cubism because it is slightly flattened. It's been flattened to be almost like an ancient relief, so you can make it out in a graphic sense against this flat background. But there you have the coming together of academic carving skill and the romantic, vision of the hero. Romanticism in Germany is best epitomized by Caspar David Friedrich, the mysterious and emotionally powerful German painter. He liked ruins because the ruins could tell you a story of history, but they also told you a story of how history, went wrong or went bad. And of course, that was a powerful narrative after Napoleon. It allowed a sense of the occult, that you could maybe conjure ghosts, or if you will, the ghosts of the past in your paintings. And his most famous painting, The Wander Above the Sea of Fog, is also a painting about individuality, about standing alone in nature and contemplating its forces and seeing nature itself as an allegory of history and possibility. And one interesting fact that I want to give you about Caspar David Friedrich is when he was, I think, 7 or 8 years old, he watched his brother fall into and drown in an icy lake. And you have to wonder psychologically how that experience comes through in The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, because it does seem to be a painting about loss, among other things. One thing that I want to give you as a kind of a philosophical point of view, all across Europe, there was more and more disillusionment with what we'd call materialistic society, the society of empire. And that did lead to new forms of spirituality. And the natural world was one of the vehicles for this new idea about God, if you will. So naturally, makes sense that there would be more romantic landscape painting across Europe. And Romanticism developed not just in Germany, but also in England and the United States, expressing both nostalgia and spirituality. And you'll notice if you look at American landscape painting of the 19th century, it was a way of spiritualizing the colonialization of the New World. John Constable painted this painting that showed a place from his childhood memories, the Haywain. It's the most popular painting in the Tate. They sell the most posters of it, and I'm sure the most coffee mugs, because even in 1821, there was a sense that materialism and industrialization was changing the landscape of Britain. So going back to the memory of the man with a hay cart crossing, the water after a storm in front of the old house, it really tugged at the emotions of people nostalgic for the changes of Britain. And a fact I love to give people about Constable is he was so dedicated to landscape and to landscape painting that when he was ill in bed, he'd have his wife bring him broccoli so he could practice painting trees. Turner, we've talked about, and we know that Turner was his own man. We know that he was eccentric, but very definitely the idea that he had of the sky and the sunset as some kind of an image of God and change, that really infused, I'm going to say, landscape painting ever since. The idea of the blazing sunset made its way into painting, particularly through Turner. Here are some paintings made in the New World, the Oxbow by Thomas Cole. And isn't it interesting that when he could have simply showed us, the bend in the river in Northampton, Massachusetts, he showed us the bend in the river after a thunderstorm. Maybe that's even the influence of Turner making its way across the Atlantic. But he showed us both, the vista, but he also showed us the power of nature in that vista. And do you notice it's very, very small, but if you look toward the lower right, you can see a banner planted, which lets you know that there's an expedition in the area charting this out. Albert Bierstadt, of course, was a great German artist that worked here in California, and you can find his paintings in San Francisco or at the Oakland Museum of California Art. And he made, almost photographic, splendid, spectacular images, particularly of Yosemite, that introduced it to anyone that could see a traveling canvas. And you want to remember that photography couldn't yet do this, but within a few decades it could. But before that, Bierstadt gave people, the most elegant and splendid spectacles of the New West, 10 feet wide. This painting is in the Smithsonian. Edwin Church, one of the Hudson River painters, Twilight in the Wilderness. And again, you can see that we're getting almost towards the photographic with the use of glazes in the sky to give us salmon red and orange against that kind of yellow horizon. The New World as spectacle, a world to be claimed and a world sanctified by God. In France, a new current appears in the middle of the 19th century. It's called realism, and it's very, very diverse. But let's look at some realist painting and show you how that, I don't know, in a way it refuted both neoclassicism and romanticism. It was something new entirely. It was a political and social statement. And among the artists who used it best, we think of Courbet, Daumier, and Millet. And in particular, they gave us the lives of people of a class that had not yet been depicted, the growing middle class and the peasant class. So this painting was destroyed by American bombers in 1945. It was in Dresden, but it was a great early Courbet of stonebreakers. And nobody had portrayed this kind of subject before of two men turning away from us as they break up rocks to make a road. And among the things that I think people would have criticized about this painting, they would have said, why all the drab gray and tan colors? And why can't you give us some heroic nude figures? Because a neoclassical artist would have given them bodies like statues. Well, their bodies are not part of the subject, but their suspenders and their cheap trousers and their ripped shirts and their bad shoes are. And I can see that one of them is Dutch because he's wearing Dutch wooden shoes as he kneels on dried out straw to break rocks. And again, a critic would have asked, why this subject matter? Or what about burial? Not the burial of a king or a diplomat or a church official, but simply a burial in his hometown of Ornans, near the Swiss border, near the Jura. You notice in 1849 that as the clergy give the final blessing, and as they kneel by the dirt grave, there's even a dog at the services. And of course, a critic would have said, why would you have a dog in a great history painting? But again, drabness, dark colors, grays and blacks, even a very, very gloomy day to make it all of it, more anti-academic. Courbet was a kind of I'll call him the Ernest Hemingway of painting. He had a tremendous sense of himself. And in 1855, he painted this gigantic painting you can see now at the Orsay that was an allegory of his life as an artist. And what I want you to notice at the center is that as Courbet paints, he's very absorbed in his own work. And a woman that maybe earlier was modeling for him, the nude model, looks on over his shoulder, and you can almost hear him say adoringly, "Wow, you're a great painter." And you get the same high opinion from a little boy who looks up as you look up to a great man and has brought his dog into the studio. And later, if you want to learn about this painting, Wikipedia is always a help, right? I'm not going to read you all of this, but I want to give you an idea. He divided the painting into crowds on both sides. And so his friends and his collectors and his patrons are all there on the left, and on the right are, more ordinary people. But they all come together, they all join together in Courbet's studio. It's as if to say the whole of France are his models. What a statement. When you look at this painting, Young Ladies Behind the Seine, you are probably not offended. Maybe you take a look and you say, well, those are kind of lacy dresses they're women wearing. Well, it was an offensive painting when it was first displayed because any proper Parisian, upscale Parisian, would have recognized prostitutes. And the woman in the foreground is very likely sleeping off a hangover, waking up in the morning after a busy night the night before. They have the cheap bouquets, which some young gentlemen who paid for their services would have left them. And as critics might have noted, they don't seem to be Venuses. They are not the fine-featured, elegant young women that you might have found in an allegorical painting. And again, a critic would have rolled their eyes at this and asked, why are you painting these women? Why are you not painting Liberty? Why are you not painting duchesses? And of course, this is a painting, it really wasn't seen until 1988 when it emerged from a series of private collections. But this painting, The Origin of the World, was a scandalous painting that he painted for an Ottoman diplomat in 1866, probably using his mistress, Joanna Heffernan, who was also a painter, as the model. And of course, the statement that Courbet wants to make is, how could this be obscene when it is the source of the world? And that is, in some ways, the ultimate realist statement. If it exists in the world, it is part of art. Courbet, when you learn a little bit more about him, erected his own pavilion in 1867, gave him his own exhibition because nobody else could quite do it for him. And when you read about his politics, yes, he was a socialist. And yes, he got in a lot of trouble and spent time in jail when he helped pull over the Vendôme column a few years after this exposition. Died of alcoholism and made a lot of late paintings of trout fishing. An amazing and wonderful character and painter. Millet, I think more than any other French painter, fused realism with religious sentimentality. If there was a kind of a quote or a legend that would go with this painting, The Gleaners, it would be the meek will inherit the earth, because it valorizes the lives of people who do the hard work in the fields. And of course, the gleaners are the people that come after the harvesters. The harvest has already been taken. We already see the hay going on to the wagons, but they come along with these aprons and get the seeds and the last stems of wheat. And they are the lowest of the low in terms of where they are on the labor chain. And Millet portrays them with dignity. Daumier was a cartoonist, but also a painter, took on subject matter that had not been seen before, the despair and the difficulty of the lives of the poor. In this case, a man who has fallen in a stupor off his bed. And I don't know if you can see that he's actually crushing a child under his body. Again, I think of Daumier as someone that would be a documentary filmmaker now, but lithography, mass production of images, allowed images like this to be put into newspapers or into booklets where they could raise public issues. And here in his painting from 1862, The Third Class Carriage. So he's portraying the same kind of people that Courbet would have portrayed, the people that are in the very, very cheapest train as they make their way to or away from Paris. And we even have a kind of Madonna image as a woman nurses her child leaning on the basket held by her farmer husband. Rosa Bonheur was one of the great academic painters of the mid-19th century. And I want to drop a tip out there. If you'd like to see her work in person and you can't go to Paris, try the Hagen Museum near Sacramento. where there was a 19th century collector that bought a lot of great works by Bonheur. She was a celebrity in her own time. Yes, she did dress in men's clothes, and yes, she had a great number of students, and what had a reputation up there with Bouguereau. She was up there with the other great academic painters. This is a very lively painting, the Horse Fair of 1855, and I'm sure many, many lithographs were made of that painting. Because I'm trying to cover so much ground today, and I'm looking at the clock, I think we covered Monet or Manet when we talked about modernism. So I'm really just going to make one comment as I show you this painting by Manet. There was something of a realist in Manet. I think that Courbet had influenced him. And maybe what you see in Manet, even though this painting has this sense of strangeness and it's very how do I say it, very artificial in the way the nude figure's been inserted and all of that. But I think that Courbet showed Manet that painting could be a vehicle for social statements and that the artist could be in charge of what you want to say about the world and the people in it. And so from Manet, we get this dose of realism that he inherited from gutsy Courbet before him. Uh, if we had been in Paris in this era, we wouldn't have been talking about Impressionists at all. We would have been talking about Bouguereau. We would have been talking about the academic painters. He was, I think, the wealthiest painter in Paris when this was, shown in 1873. And later he would become the first painter of Matisse. And Matisse came to his class and found Bouguereau copying one of his own paintings, which Matisse truly despised. But I guess the point I want to make about realism and Bouguereau is that we can feel photography and painting developing together. And I wouldn't call Bouguereau a neoclassicist because I wouldn't say his work is rooted in drawing. It's really more rooted in a kind of realism that would appeal to the lens. And there's a sense of clarity and there's a sense of lighting that's also developing in photography as it develops in academic painting. In American realism, look at this painting at the end of the Civil War by Winslow Homer. The portrayal of the field has a little bit of impressionism. It has a brushy, painterly quality, but we are told by the title that this man is a veteran. And is there some kind of allegory here? The threshing of the fields after the tragedies and the horror of the Civil War. Maybe there's if you will, symbolism of young men being cut down that's still played out in a realist painting. Realist painting definitely look to photography and even look back to Rembrandt, to give us paintings like the Gross Clinic by Akins, where you could paint science and you could tell us what was happening in the world of medicine and science, and you could do it in a very, very frank, respectful, academic way, turn it into a history painting. And would I call John Singer Sargent a realist? Well, I'm going to put him on the edge. He definitely was a portrait artist capable of tremendous likeness, so realism, if you will, but the flair of his brush, his ability to give us the flicker and the fluttering of light and a fabric, here the reflection against a Ming vase by one of the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. He brought together the best of both worlds, a French painting and of a new kind of realism. One of his most famous paintings, the portrait of Madame X, which created controversy in 1884, was a painting that he requested to make. In other words, Madame Gautreau did not come to him, but he went to her. And she was a society beauty who had been taking arsenic because it was like the Botox of the time. Taking just a little bit of arsenic would make you, what would you say, just a little bit poisoned and give you the pale skin that was required of a society beauty at the time. Tanner, one of the first African American painters, painting in the, if you will, in the style of Millet, giving us piety and a prayer in a humble home. Beautiful, beautiful lighting, like Vermeer coming in from the window behind the man who leans into his hands. One more school, and again, could do an entire lecture about this school. There's so much to say, but let's say a little bit about them. The Pre-Raphaelites were a group of poets, painters, and art critics that came together in the middle of the 19th century, and they had a point of view, a very distinctive individual point of view. They thought that art had, in many ways, gone downhill since Giotto, since the 14th century in Italian art. What they rejected were the kind of the mechanistic academic ways of painting adopted by Mannerists, and then later the kind of the florid style that came after Raphael. So they thought that all of that had to be, if you will, put aside. They did believe in mimesis. They believed in the imitation of nature, and they embraced detail. And they also thought that history painting was a central purpose of painting. So in Millet's Ophelia, you may have heard the famous story about he got the model to model in a cold bathtub, but what an incredible setting he gave it. It's almost like she and nature are the same, floating down the river, her eyes closing in death. In some ways, it feels like a romantic theme, a very, very morbid theme. Or in the work of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, he was contemplating the death of his wife some years before, but also referring to a poem by Dante when he made this painting that has a title, if you translate it, The New Life. And so it's in a way, it's a painting about resurrection, but the resurrection of a woman rather than the resurrection of Christ.